Welcome to the legacy of Canadian Redress. I'm so grateful to be joining you from and to be living on the traditional and unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kikite, and Tsawwassen First Nations. I'm Lorene Oikawa, president of the National Association of Japanese Canadians. I'm a Yonsei, a fourth-generation Japanese Canadian. We thank Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for the opportunity to join with all of you today and be part of this wonderful transformation into a community virtual pilgrimage. For Japanese Canadians, the legacy of Redress is to work towards the elimination of racial discrimination and intolerance and work with other Canadian groups and Indigenous peoples for justice and equity for all. The racism perpetuated by the government on Japanese Canadians must never happen again to any other group of people. Both Indigenous and Japanese Canadian stories have been left out of the historical narrative of Canada for too long. We will hear stories from two speakers, Indigenous and Japanese Canadian. But first, a brief visual history of Japanese Canadians in British Columbia, the West Coast province, so for Americans like the West State of Canada. First up, we'll see slide 1. This is a map of British Columbia, and Japanese Canadians recognize that Indigenous peoples are the first peoples who have been here for time immemorial. This map was produced by the First Peoples Cultural Council, and it shows the languages which represent about 50% of the Indigenous languages in Canada. British Columbia has over 200 First Nations. Indigenous peoples had their own cultures, government, labor, and economies. We're going to go to slide 2. So an image that sometimes we aren't familiar with, traditional cultures of Indigenous peoples, fishing, trapping, trade. European settlers started contact in the 1700s, and colonization began to change everything. The European settlers took over the land and natural resources. Slide 3, please. This is an image of a story that is particularly in British Columbia that we're not familiar with. It was a First Nations chief that first discovered coal on Vancouver Island and started mining it. But what's remembered today, as you see on streets, names of street signs, etc., is the white coal baron Dunsmuir, who owned all the coal mines on Vancouver Island. And this is typical. Most stories about the history of labor in British Columbia neglect to mention that First Nations helped the settlers with labor. We'll see a few images. Slide 4, please. In fishing, slide 5. Canneries, slide 6. Farmland, field hands. Japanese Canadians were settlers who began arriving in what we now know as British Columbia, Canada, from the 1800s, and also then became part of the labor of British Columbia. Slide 8, please. In coal mining, this is a picture from Cumberland on Vancouver Island. Slide 9. Fishers. Slide 10. Canneries. Slide 11. In the farms, the field hands. This is actually a shot of a strawberry farm in Surrey, British Columbia, which is where I live. Slide 12. Japanese Canadians also worked in the sawmills and logging. So Indigenous peoples and Japanese Canadians would play a huge role in the labor of this province, from fishing to forestry. Sadly, both groups would face racism rough, risky work, and for less pay than white workers. Indigenous peoples also face other injustices, including agonizing family separations and abuse of children in residential schools. So racism was building. British Columbia was tracking Japanese Canadians. Federal government was requiring Japanese Canadians to register, and this continued to build. And then in 1941, on December 7th, Pearl Harbor was bombed. Slide 13, please. An image of all the fishing boats of Japanese Canadians in the Metro Vancouver area. On December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Canada declared war on Japan, and 1,200 fishing boats were taken from Japanese Canadians by the Canadian Navy. In 1942, about 22,000 Canadians of Japanese ancestry were labeled enemy aliens and forcibly removed from the west coast of Canada. With rumors and fear-mongering, the federal government used the War Measures Act to unjustly uproot Japanese Canadians and take their property, including land, businesses, vehicles, fishing boats, which you've seen, and personal property. Slide 14, please. This might be familiar to some folks. This is Hastings Park, where currently now, and including myself, growing up, we would go every year to the summer fair, the Pacific National Exhibition. These are the livestock barns, and this is where my family and other families, approximately 8,000, primarily from outside of Vancouver, the city, were sent here first to live in these horrible conditions. Slide 15. They were shipped by train. This is a scene from Slocan City in the interior. They were shipped to the interior to old ghost towns. Slide 16, please. And what they call internment camps. And it was ghost towns, so some dilapidated buildings, some shacks were hastily built by Japanese Canadian men. And when they ran out of space, they resided in tents. This is the Bay Farm camp in the interior of BC. They also separated men from their families and sent them to road camps. Families were told you could stay together if you would agree to go to sugar beet farms in other provinces, Alberta and Manitoba, which sounded like a good thing. But when they arrived there, they realized it was very harsh conditions for the whole family. Some families having to stay in chicken coops. And then the government demanded that Japanese Canadians choose to go east of the Rockies or be deported to Japan. And I say deported with quote marks because most were Canadian citizens born in Canada and had never been to Japan. The government extended the War Measures Act to keep Japanese Canadians incarcerated for another 4 years after the end of World War II. And it wasn't until 1949 that Japanese Canadians could return to the West Coast. Slide 17, please. It was, for many, it wasn't a choice though, because it was a matter of resources. They had everything taken away from them from the government, and so they would have to start from scratch. There was no return to a home. It was gone, taken and sold from them. In 1949, Japanese Canadians would get franchise, be recognized as citizens, and be able to vote. This is a scene actually from a museum in Steveston, which is part of Richmond, a city within the Metro Vancouver area. And that's actually a photo of my Uncle Buck, T. Buck Suzuki, who was a fisher. Slide 19, please. Slide 18. Jump the gun. Slide 18. This is showing the National Association of Japanese Canadians started a campaign in 1984 and negotiated a historic redress settlement on behalf of all Japanese Canadians who suffered injustices and acts of discrimination during the Second World War. The signing of the historic agreement with the federal government took place on September 22nd, 1988. So this is just a really fast, quick tour of Japanese Canadian history. If we can go to slide 19, please. For more information about Japanese Canadian history, check out the National Association of Japanese Canadians website, najc.ca. And we have a timeline on there. We also have links to other resources. So information plus links to organizations. I would like to do a quick little thank you to Erica Landrock. She's the film producer of Working People. It's a history of labor in British Columbia. And I use snips from the films, including the film about my Uncle Buck, Tatsuro Suzuki, who, as I mentioned, was a fisher and a leader who helped the return of Japanese Canadian fishers and was an early environmental leader protecting our water. Unfortunately, racism wasn't erased with that apology or any apology. We've seen an increase in anti-Asian racism with COVID-19. We've stood with Black Lives Matter, and we continue to speak up and support reconciliation and a call for justice for Indigenous peoples. We have two speakers who will share their perspectives of their communities and the intersection of Indigenous peoples and Japanese Canadians in their fight for their rights, their communities, and their environment. First, it is my honor to welcome and introduce Judith Sayers. Judith is president of the Nuchalnuth Tribal Council, a member and former chief of the Hupacasath First Nations. She is a strategic advisor on First Nations issues and an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law and Business at the University of Victoria. In 2019, she was appointed to the Order of Canada for her work on sustainable energy initiatives in Indigenous communities. Judith, welcome. Oh, Judith, sorry, you're unmute, please. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. There you go. It's really good to be with all of you today to discuss some very important matters. I'm pleased to come to you today from the Nuu-chah-nulth territories, the west coast of Vancouver Island, and Port Alberni, where it's currently 31 degrees. So, hot day. I'm going to talk about First Nations people. The term now is Indigenous, but Indigenous includes Métis and Inuit. And I'm going to be giving the history about the First Nations people. And we have been on our lands since time immemorial, or Ichmut, we say in our language, further than the mind can think. We were very rich in our resources. We had the whole territory to choose where we fished, where we hunted, where we gathered. Abundability is one of the words I like to use because we had so much. Of course, there were harsh years where, there was storms or heat and times when maybe the fish didn't return. But, most of the time we were really well off and rich in what we had. And of course, the first people started arriving here by boat. In our language, we call them amathne, those that arrived by boat, and changed our whole world. And the history of colonization of our people began. And I think that the biggest impact that we had as First Nations people is that our lands were taken from us. We were put on very small reserves. And today, in 2020, we're still looking for compensation, for redress, for the return of our lands. And because, when the first people arrived, they didn't beat us in a war. We didn't sign treaties, or most of the people on the west coast of British Columbia. And there's a few modern treaties now where they've come to agreements. But for the most part, a lot of us have never, ever been compensated for our lands. And it's still a struggle for us and for the resources. And so while Canada becomes a really rich nation based on our resources, we have never been compensated, nor do we share revenue on most of what has been taken. So the whole issue of Aboriginal title and who owns the land is still alive and well in British Columbia. And we've been to the courts several times, And we finally, in 1997, had a court case called Delgamuukw where they said Aboriginal title does exist in British Columbia. And then we further, in 2004, had the Chilcotin case, which said Aboriginal title exists, and they declared that 5% of the Chilcotin territory was Aboriginal title lands. And this was a real step forward, but for most of us, we've never been able to negotiate with the federal government. So I think, this sets us apart from a lot of people in that we have never been compensated for land. And although we've tried many, many, many years, we have never been able to achieve that compensation, that redress, return of lands and resources. And in fact, really have become the poorest of the poor in many of our communities where we can have up to 90% unemployment. So I think that was one of the key ways that the federal government attacked us. And I think they attacked us on lands, they attacked us on governance, they attacked us on culture and identity. So, things like they didn't like that we had hereditary chiefs, so that would pass down from father to son to father to son. They wanted us to have an elected system. And so many communities did change to elective systems. And so changed the structure of our governance in such a way that we lost a lot of our ability to govern ourselves in that way because they imposed their values on us, which wasn't an election, it was our history. They attacked us on our culture. They took away our right to do all our traditional dancing, our singing, our ways of being. They banned what we call the potlatch, sun dances, anything that included spirituality, because they always considered we were heathens and that that these things that we were doing was wrong in their eyes because they didn't understand it. And so and much of our regalia was taken from us. People were put in jail for actually carrying on our culture. And so there's still a lot of redress and compensation that is needed, for such things as our culture. Who is an Indian? We had this legislation called the Indian Act, and they decided who was an Indian. And one of the main issues there was that they made the lineage through the male. And not all of our communities were patrilineal, they were matrilineal. And again, we lost our ability to say who our family was, who our nations were, because the government was doing that. And of course, that went to court. And we're still working on being able to define our own citizens. There's so much that has happened through the years. Our governance, as I explained, came from hereditary chiefs into elected chiefs. But this instrument they called the Indian Act was one of the worst things that ever happened to us. So the Indian Act in 1868 to 1951 said that we weren't persons. Indigenous people were not people. And they also wouldn't allow us to vote because we didn't have property, although lots of people didn't have property. In 1875, the BC Elections Act talked about no Chinaman or Indian can vote. So you can see the attitudes and the whole colonialism, paternalism that we've lived with. And the courts upheld that definition of who could vote and who cannot vote. In 1950, they changed the Indian Act. So if we gave up our freedom, we could vote if we gave up our freedom from taxation and we wanted to be taxed. So many things. It wasn't until 1960 that Canada actually amended the Citizenship Act to call us citizens. Up until that point, we had no country. But in BC, we were allowed to vote in 1949. So, there were so many things that we as Indigenous people, and it's difficult in a short period of time to explain to you everything that we have. So, we have supported Japanese people in getting redress for things that were wronged. And my daughter was just telling me about this new term that I didn't know about, and then she was saying it's the Oppression Olympics. Who is going to be compensated first for what happened to them by the Canadian government? Because all of this came up at us from the Canadian government. And so, we continue to try and go through what needs to be done. And recently, the provincial government has adopted a law to implement the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which does talk about compensation, that does talk about redress, that we should be allowed to be compensated for because our cultural sites were taken, our sacred sites were taken. And so I think, in many ways, the intersection of Indigenous people and Japanese people is in trying to find the Canadian government to say, hey, we did something wrong. We need to make compensation. We need to be able to address these issues. And so over the years, that's something that we have tried very hard to do. And, I think that, there's so much that has gone on within Canada. Lorraine mentioned the residential schools. And, our children were put in residential schools and abused in many ways, sexually, mentally, emotionally. We're still trying to get over this trauma. It took many, many, many years to negotiate a compensation package, and everybody was given a settlement based on how many years you were in residential school. If you were sexually abused or mentally abused or other things, you had to go through a tribunal in order to get more money than the basic. So that was one thing that we were able to achieve. But even that, does money really compensate for the physical, mental, emotional trauma that you actually had in residential school? So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today and to talk about some of these things that have happened. And I think it's great that we can support one another as we move forward and trying to get the Canadian government on side with many of the things that they did wrong. And it's a big part of our lives as First Nations people to try and achieve that. So hopefully in the discussion, we can have some more discussion on this, answer some questions, and look forward to Paul's comments on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I'd like to welcome and introduce Paul Kariya. Paul comes from a Japanese Canadian commercial fishing family. He's a senior policy advisor with Coastal First Nations in pursuit of a sustainable coastal economy. He represented Canada as a commissioner on the Pacific Salmon Commission and was executive director of the BC Treaty Commission. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Lorene. Good to see you. Judith, good to see you. So I grew up on the west coast of Vancouver Island. That's where I consider home. And these are in the territories of Judith's people. Yakluit is a tourism place now where people come to surf and sport fish and hang out. But my grandfather came from Wakayama, Ken, in about 1918 to 20 to fish for salmon. We are fishing people from Wakayama, and that's what he wanted to do. His first stop was the Fraser River, and he tried to get a license there. He was pushed out. It was just too competitive, but also the racism was such that the government was going to reduce licensing for Japanese Canadians who were dominating the Fraser River salmon fishery, and to reduce it by 40%. And so being a relative newcomer to the fishery, my grandfather was pushed out and told, go to the west coast of Vancouver Island if you want to become a fisherman, because there isn't anybody there and there's lots of fish. You have to understand, and at that time, it was probably the lowest point New Channel villages out there in terms of impact from diseases and that. And the First Nation community in Ucluelet was probably no more than 100 people, maybe less at that time, their lowest point because of disease and that. It was also a time when there were maybe a couple of hundred white settlers, people who were given 160 acres, what they called preemption, by showing up and building a house. About that time, as the Japanese were pushed into that area, and it was good fishing for sure, the population grew such that in the 1930s, well, it was a low point for the First Nation population. The settlers from the white side of things were growing. The largest proportion of people there were Japanese Canadians. In the mid-1930s, there might have been upwards of 450 or 500 Japanese Canadians there. And they helped build the school. In fact, they built the school. Japanese carpenters built the public school in Ucluelet. There were places of worship. The presence on the landscape was very strong. The communities didn't particularly interact that well. There were sports days and things like that when they did gather. There was people missing at sea, and the communities did come together. But beyond that, there wasn't a lot of mixing going on. Japanese were kicked out, and what's so sad in so many respects is that there is nothing on the landscape to show the presence of Japanese Canadians today. I've returned to where I grew up. I've built a summer home there, and I plan to spend more time in my semi-retirement out there. In fact, I've been isolating with my adult children during this COVID period out there, and I'm spending time with kids I went to school with, and that both in the First Nation community and the white community. I should say that a little project that I've been working on is to try and talk a little bit about that period of time when people didn't talk. The communities were isolated. And so the Historical Society there has a really neat mixture. They're all women, by the way, of elder Japanese Canadian women who returned after the war, some First Nation people from the Ucluelet First Nation, and some of the original settler families, the great-grandchildren of the people who preempted land. And we had a neat luncheon at our place my wife hosted just before the pandemic struck. And what was really neat was a woman named Violet Mundy was over, and I don't know what age Violet is, but she's a respected elder there. And it was a sensitive subject, but she leaned over to me and she said, as you say, Paul, our communities were somewhat isolated. The First Nation community was isolated by geography also. It was across the bay, and the only back and forth with the white community was through boat, and then the Japanese Canadians were scattered in 5 little settlements. But Vi leaned across to me and said, what happened to Japanese Canadians was an absolute shame and travesty. And we talked about it as First Nations people, but we didn't speak up. We didn't say anything to anybody else. And your people just disappeared, came on the boats, were taken away, and never returned until after the war. And I leaned across to the 2 Japanese Canadian women who were there, and I'll name them because they're such terrific leaders, Mary Komodo and her niece Ellen Komodo. Ellen, who was my grade 7 teacher in Ucluelet. And I said, it's a shame what's been going on here, that we don't talk. And you guys are the keepers of talking. And the ladies laughed and said, you're right. It's us women who have built the bridges to talk. And I think it was Ellen who said, in response in part to Vi, but said, we have a voice, and some of us are louder than others. She's a very outspoken woman, and said, we in our community, our elders used to talk about what was happening to the First Nations people in Ucluelet, but we didn't say anything. We were trying so hard to fit in and make our way with the white settlers, we didn't say anything either. And I think we're at that point in time in the little Historical Society group that met at my place, and we're trying to move ahead with it, it's time to speak out. And I think, if COVID hadn't struck, we had a workshop planned for April, and we're going to invite people from wherever and bring the three communities together. It's interesting, the chatter in the town had been Paul, this outsider, someone who had lived here a long time ago and is now stirring up trouble by having these ladies talk about what was. But, and I'm not a Facebook person, but others have said to me, good on you guys, because it needs to be spoken of. Let's not be silent anymore. Today, I have the pleasure of working for First Nations who are on Lorraine's map, north of Vancouver Island, all the way up to Alaska on the coast. And they're very similar to Judith's people, but very different people, similar in terms of their dependence upon the ocean. They're fishing people. And we've got some unique initiatives underway that hopefully will protect the environment. The nations are very proud that we have pushed for and successfully saw legislation through Canada's federal parliament that bans oil tankers from the northern waters. We're today Canada's largest seller of forest-based carbon credits. We got to do a better job in selling them, but so far it's our carbon credits, or the nation's carbon credits, that make the British Columbia government as a subnational state carbon neutral in their government. So their hospitals, their schools, their universities, and that are covered through carbon credits from the forests that are no longer being logged aggressively because of the will of the people of the coastal First Nations. Maybe I'll stop there. I think there's so much we can open up in discussion. Thanks very much, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Paul. So we do have an opportunity to answer some questions. We have one question. Gordon, he asks, what did the government do with the proceeds from confiscating property of Japanese Canadians? Well, they justified it by saying that this was paying for their imprisonment. At one point at Hastings Park, the government bragged that it only cost them a few cents per person. I'll share a brief story. My uncle, who was a little boy, so my grandmother and the kids were sent to Hastings Park, and my grandfather, but the men were separated out and they had to stay in one building. The teenage boys were separated from their families and had to stay in another building. And then the moms with their kids and older women stayed in another building. But there was one building where the meals were prepared, and then like a mess hall or something where they go for the meals. So my uncle was a little mischievous, Dennis the Menace. He went exploring with his buddy, and they climbed up somewhere on this building where the food's prepared. And he said there was an opening, and they looked down, and they saw this big bowl that looked like it was ground meat. And they stared at it. He said he stared at it, and he said they were moving. It was moving. That there was bugs in there. So with stories like that, I can imagine, and the government bragging that it was only a few cents per person that it cost them. When they took all the property, so whether it was farms or businesses or cars or fishing boats, there was no permission from Japanese and Canadians. And in fact, Japanese Canadians were under the belief that their property was going to be taken care of by the custodian of any alien property, but it was all sold, and big fire sale. You can see actually in some of the archives, some of the ads that the government had put out for selling things cheap. And I also remember this one time I was giving a speech, and this gentleman came up to me afterwards and he says, I have to apologize to you. And I'm looking, I'm thinking, I don't know you. And I said, well, what? Apologize for what? And he said, when he was a little boy, his father had bought vehicles and different things and was just crowing about he got it for so cheap and he was so happy. And now he realizes that it was Japanese Canadian property that his family benefited from. So some stories. John mentions the difficulty in getting land returned to them. Has there been a large-scale organized effort to do this, or has it been mostly small groups and individuals? So I think Judith is...
Oh, thank you for that question. I was just thinking about all the fishing boats that you had in those early years, and it was the same thing with the Nuu-chah-nulth. We had many fishing boats. People made a lot of money on fishing, but what happened is our license were taken away from us, and so people had to sell their boats. So we lost our fishing in a different way. With respect to the land question, we've been trying to negotiate land since almost since contact. And I know that in 1920, there's a picture that we have in our First Nations office, and it's a picture of all the chiefs in Nechumeth standing in Port Alberni. There was a church, and they had been negotiating land claims in 1921. And then soon after that, through the Indian Act, they banned us talking about land claims and hiring lawyers to do so. So for many years, we weren't allowed to negotiate land. And so in 1992, Paul can correct me, we started the treaty process where we were to sit down at tables with the government and negotiate getting our lands back. And we've only had 5 treaties that have been negotiated, and there's not much land that's given through treaty, but you're allowed to buy more land if you have the money or you would like to. So it has been an ongoing long process of negotiations, of court cases, of doing everything we possibly can, but the political will has just not been there. So it isn't individuals as such, it's our nations as a whole that have sat at tables with governments trying to get our land back. And that's kind of the theme that we've been working on. It really is land back. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, well, we'll wait for another question. Paul, did you want to, I know you were talking a little bit about your project, and I know COVID has stalled it a bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about when you're able to meet again, what the next part of the project is?
Yeah, we were going to advertise in the local media and then get it out to different parts of Canada where we know Japanese Canadians. Many of them who settled east of the Rockies didn't come back, and to try and reach out to them, give them lots of notice, and have a bit of a sharing session. We were going to try and get as many people as we could, call it a bit of a reunion, whatever. And hopefully, it could have happened with good notice so that people could make an event of it, and then just pry a little bit of sharing between what were the perspectives from the different communities, and try and do it in a way that isn't negative. That was the theme that the ladies wanted, is that there's no point in being negative about it, but what can we do to help build bridges between our communities? That was the goal. And so we're still hoping we can do something. However this drags out with COVID, I'm not sure. And the committee tend to be older people, and so we'll see. As I say, there were some interesting rumors going about town. I was in the co-op store overhearing people talking about me, and this smart alecky guy who's returned and thinks he's a big city slicker, and he's built a house and thinks he's a local now. And but there are other people who are quite supportive, saying, no, we've got a past that's shameful, and we've got to talk about it. I know Judith has been involved. There's an elementary school in a street named in Port Alberni for a former MLA and a former member of the government, an elementary school named A.W. Neal. And I know that the Historical Society in Ucluelet has been involved in trying to get some name changes. And that same group has also led an initiative in the neighboring town of Tofino. Tofino had passed, well, it didn't quite get to passing it. They have a bylaw on their books as a town council, kind of announcing to the governments after the Japanese Canadians were kicked out that no Japs would ever return again. And this law, this bylaw, which hadn't been fully proclaimed, was still on the books, and was only 2 years ago that Tofino did the right thing as a council. The town council invited elders in the communities, both Native, Japanese Canadians, and white, to say, look, we're sorry and we're embarrassed about this, and we should have done this a long time ago, but it's formally rescinded. Because people have asked me, Paul, how come when there were Japanese Canadians fishing out of Tofino, Ucluelet, nobody ever returned to Tofino? They're all the 20 families that returned after the war moved to Ucluelet, including my family. And partly it's because the town had said to them, don't come back. Anyways, there's lots to be uncovered, talked about, a lot of healing that needs to go on. We'll see where that goes.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I heard, as you know, National Association of Japanese Canadians also wrote letters to council about that name. And yeah, we were shocked to find out there's still a law that only a few years ago was wiped from the books.
Yeah.
Gordon has a question. Japanese Canadians born in Canada automatically citizens, as Nisi in the US were, or did statutes regulate citizenship and voting, as mentioned for the Chinese? Unfortunately, yes, the governments prevented Asians like Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, and Indigenous folks from voting. It was in, I just want to check the date, 1931. So in World War I, our Issei, our first generation Japanese Canadians, wanted to show their loyalty and fight for their country, Canada, which they did. And one of the things they were told, they were promised they would get the vote. Well, surprise, surprise, they do. They get killed, they fight, they come back, and they're told, no, you don't get the vote. So they fought for it. And it was in 1931, they became the only Japanese Canadians qualified to vote. Unfortunately, this didn't protect them in 1942 in terms of the uprooting, internment, dispossession. They also had all their property taken and were imprisoned as well. And then I mentioned my uncle Buck, T. Buck Suzuki. So in World War II, the Japanese Canadians tried to also enlist and show their support to prove their loyal to Canada, and they were rejected. But my uncle got accepted with the British Army, although the story became that he was lent to the British Army, and then he was able to assist in that. But anyway, as was mentioned, it wasn't till 1947 that Chinese Canadians and South Asians could vote, and then 1949 Japanese Canadians, and then not until 1960 Indigenous folks could vote. What's next comment? Paul and Judith, thank you so much for sharing your story. Heartening to hear the potential collaboration. Oh, Judith, a question for you.
Okay. I don't think that the situation in the Channel Territories is unique. I think it's happened to all First Nations across Canada. There have been treaties negotiated across Canada, treaties 1 through 11, which really didn't address all the issues of First Nations lands and resources. And some have tried to renegotiate some of those early treaties. So British Columbia is unique in that there are now 5 modern treaties that have resolved in the First Nations way to get their lands and resources back. Really, in my opinion, there's not a lot that was given to them, or given back to them, I should say. But no, all of this happened to us. We've all been living under the Indian Act. We've all been living under the policies, of the federal government. We're trying to make some positive changes. I was thinking as I was preparing for this about all the Japanese Canadians that were helping to build a railway across the country. And I'm not sure if those workers knew that the land was taken from the First Nations on Vancouver Island. They gave a third of the island to the ENN Railway. And this prevents the First Nations on the islands from even getting land, because it was given to Dunsmuir and different, the organization of the railway. And so that's still something that people are fighting right now, as well as land that was taken for the purposes of the railway. So there are so many issues, I think, that we're all dealing with. But and I think that's why we worked so hard to get the Declaration of Indigenous Rights implemented in Canada, hoping that those principles would change the picture. of what's happening to us. But unfortunately, we're not seeing anything. We believe that we should have the consent to any development in our territories. And as you know, the federal government instead bought a pipeline and are proceeding to develop that, which impacts strongly on our rights. In some cases, it could even eliminate our rights. So this whole issue about consent versus consultation is still alive and well. Yeah, there's just so many battles that we fight all the time. And so, yeah, but it does affect us all across Canada in different ways.
Thank you. I think it's Tanaka. It seems like many other Japanese Canadian communities have yet to build relationships with peoples whose land they have settled on. True for, we Canadians, we do have a nice reputation, but there's a lot more work that we can do. I know that different of the National Association of Japanese Canadian chapter organizations are making that effort. Winnipeg comes to mind. JCAM is our chapter in Winnipeg, and some of the others as well. But we can do a lot more. And I think it's incumbent on all of us, as whether organizations or individuals, to show support. So to be vocal, because as you've heard from Judith's story and Paul's story, right? Stories, it was always people didn't speak up. So now we need the voices to speak up in support and solidarity. I remember I went to one event. I was Chief Dr. Robert Joseph. He was working on reconciliation, but also residential schools. And it was brilliant. He was talking about Japanese Canadians and so forth. And he says there's been different things different groups that we've all had injustice, but he said we have to keep in mind we don't. It's not a race. It's not who had it worse. It's about all of us having had this injustice, and about now all of us working together. And I really subscribe to that. And so I think we should take any opportunity to, if you don't know, then that's okay. Learn, ask questions, how to be a good ally. Don't assume. Don't assume what you're doing is helpful. Ask the people that you're trying to help what would be helpful. Is my first suggestion, because I know sometimes people mean well, but you need to ask the people you're trying to help, how would it help you? What can I do? And sometimes how we can help is just stepping back and letting that person speak. Let them have the space so that we can hear their stories. Do you have anything else, Judith, that you'd like to add about allies and supporting Indigenous people and how we can learn more and do more?
Yes. There's so many battles that, we fight all the time. And to have another group speak up on our behalf, to have people standing with us would really, I think, move the agenda. Because mostly you don't hear from most people, on environmental issues. We get environmental groups, but that's not sufficient. We need to have a lot more people telling the Canadian government, it's time you settled with First Nations people in Canada. Let's not continue this uncertainty, this racism, this paternalism. Let's work together to resolve these issues. We're all dealing with the issue of COVID. And, the British Columbia government, Canadian government, they're telling us that when they make the decision as to when they open up our territories to let people in, and we're just saying no, you need to talk to us. We need to be the ones that say when it's safe to allow other people into our territories. And that's been a tough battle. We know the economy is important, but we place our value on people, and we've been fighting this ever since COVID started. And we need people to stand up with us and say, this should be our choice. We have the example of Haida Gwaii up on the Queen Charlotte Islands, as they used to be called, but it's now called Haida Gwaii. And they wanted no one to come into their territories, and they turned people around at the ferries. And then the Premier of British Columbia opens up British Columbia to business. And all of a sudden, there's an outbreak of the virus. There's 15 cases, and I think it's grown. And so then they shut it down in Haida Gwaii. But, you know, even though we as Nuu-chah-nulth and the people that Paul is working with, the Heiltsuk, the Chilcotin, were saying, hey, we need these things done before you allow people into our territories. And they just say no. So, I mean, something that affects our lives every day, just the right to life, and we don't have a say over that, you know. And you know, so what good is right to life if you don't have, you know, I mean, we talk about our lands and our resources, but right now we're just fighting for our lives. So just you know, as you're residing on the territories of whichever First Nation that you're with, just being able to acknowledge the territory and to say to the government, you need to work with people, because, you know, under Aboriginal title, if you own land, Aboriginal title is still a burden on your fee simple land. And people need to realize that hasn't been resolved, that we still have a say over private lands, according to the courts. And so that, you know, something that should be resolved so that you have complete certainty in your land ownership. Although, you know, the governments would never allow your land to be taken away. That's not what would happen. But that still is an existing legal burden on your title, is Aboriginal title. And until the governments actually sit down and negotiate with this, it's going to always be there.
Thank you, Judith. A question for Paul now about your family's return to the West Coast.
So my mom and dad were to be married when the war broke out, and my mom's family experienced what Lorraine's family did. My mom's family, a large family, ended up losing their store in Steveston, ended up at Hastings Park, and then relocated to the town of Greenwood. My dad, being a fisherman on the West Coast, had to bring his boat around to that picture you saw of all the boats gathered at Annieville Slough in Westminster. And from there, he had to report to the Bazaar, he's a Canadian citizen, to the Immigration Center in Vancouver, to which he refused as a Canadian citizen. And he ended up being one of the 600 put on a train to a concentration camp in Ontario. And I think once the government realized that he was more a shit disturber than a threat, they said, where would you like to go? You don't have to stay behind the barbed wire and the machine gun towers. And he said, well, I'd like to go to Greenwood to marry my mother. And he was allowed to do that, took a train on the promise that he would return to Toronto, where a mushroom farm, agreed to take my mom and my father in as workers. So my dad worked the mushroom farm until 1949, and my mom was a maid. Upon which, when the restrictions were lifted, my dad said, I'm going back to the West Coast. And one of the large fishing companies that had been starved for workers, came and grub-staked fishermen. So my father got a loan to get a new boat, and they moved to Ucluelet on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It wasn't easy, as children, walking the gravel streets of the town. My mom would shoo us to one side of the street, and we'd say, well, why are you forcing us to cross the street? And mom would say, those people don't like Japanese, and, we're going to end up in a confrontation. So just stay out of that person's way whenever you see them. And, you just learn to kind of manage your way through those early days in the late, I guess it'd be the late 50s and early 1960s. So getting back into it for my mom and dad was difficult. Maybe the most touching story that I recall is as about an 11-year-old, again, in a harbor in the Nuu-chah-nulth area, is a place called Hot Springs Cove. We had tied up one day, and my dad, just out of the blue, says, you should walk to the end of the dock there, and that boat used to be mine. He had said nothing about what had happened to him or my mother. And I just loved being a fisherman's son. And I got off our boat, walked down to the end of the dock and looked at the boat, came back and said, "What's so special about it?" He said, "Did you read the name?" And it's amazing. I'd read the name and the penny had not dropped until he said that. And I repeated, the name was Marine K. And he said, that was the boat I built in Steveston in 1935 and was taken from me. And from that point on, it just galled me that here we were with a boat, equally nice, but he'd built this boat in 35 and we were competing against it. And it used to be his. And it fished up until about, I don't know, 15 years ago. It was a beautiful boat by Kishi Boat Works out of Steveston with a diesel engine back then. Anyways, coming back was bittersweet. My folks never spoke of it. In fact, when we moved to Vancouver, when I was in high school, and I started to get involved in redress type activities, typical first generation, like he's an older Nisei, said, "I forbid you to get involved in this kind of stuff, this political activism." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "It's embarrassing. We're going to do nothing. We're going to say nothing. We're not demanding anything. And that's the way it's going to be." And it was only when I moved to Ottawa in 1985 that I jumped in and became active in the redress movement, where I wasn't disobeying him. He didn't know what I was up to. But I think there was nothing prouder than September 22nd, 88. After the apology was read in the House of Commons and I was there, I called my father and all he said was, "Good job," in Japanese. That's all he said. And it was his way. But I think he suffered a lot, maybe more than my mother, because of his pride, his male pride, and the struggles he went through in getting back to where he thought he was providing for his family. Sorry for the long answer.
No, thank you. Yes, Paul was part of the redress, all the work that was done to achieve that. So thank you. One last question. Ken, are Chinese Canadians being scapegoated like Chinese Americans are? The answer, yes. Unfortunately, people aren't making any they just kind of look at anyone who looks Asian. So a lot of Japanese Canadians, one of our Japanese Canadian elders, Sansei, she shared her story. I think she was in Steveston actually, and she got yelled at by a white woman or something, and you caused this virus, blah, 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 right? Okay, it's like, okay, one, I'm not Chinese, and two, anyway, I was born here. The other thing though is it can't be one of those things where people say, "Oh, well, it doesn't affect me, so I don't need to worry about it." It does. It affects all of us when somebody is doing some of that hate and sharing that hate. And also, there's actually a tie to Indigenous. There's an Indigenous woman in Vancouver who the same thing. Somebody assumed because of her black hair that she was Chinese and attacked her. So it's all various people are being attacked. And we have to stop this. As our provincial health authority has said in British Columbia, we need to be safe, but we need to be kind. And so, on that note, if you want more information, by the way, sorry, I'm recognizing the time, so that's why I'm being very quick with the answer. Go to najc.ca. We've got more information about the rise of anti-Asian hate in Canada, and we've developed a survey because one of the things, even though the police are recognizing there's an increase in the amount of reports, we also recognize that a lot of people don't report to the police because they say, why bother? Nothing will be done, right? So we are also tracking this. So we've developed a survey and we're asking folks to fill that out. So we'll be collecting that data and we're also talking to the government about that. So we want to work on that. And we're also working together with various groups like Chinese Canadians, etc. So working on that. So more information at najc.ca. The hour just flew by. I want to thank Judith and Paul. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, giving of your time. Judith I shouldn't say rush back, but she finished her vacation and it's like her first day back. And we scooped her for this. So thank you for doing that, Judith. And Paul is always busy with his work. Thank you so much. But it is so important to hear voices, to hear the stories. So not only thanking you for today, but thanking both of you for the work that you do every day, everything you're doing, making a difference. And the National Association of Japanese Canadians, also wants to just reiterate our commitment to speaking up for justice for Indigenous. We want to thank everyone at Tadaima, Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, and a special shout out to Royce, who helped us today, and Kimiko Mar. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us, because I know you've taken some time out of your day. And so thank you for your thoughts, your questions. But seriously, take care of yourself. Be safe. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, because it is really the most important. Your family. Take care of yourselves. Be careful. We look forward to the time when we can meet again and meet in person, when large gatherings are safe. Not safe right now, but when it's safe, we'll meet again and go meet up with you at one of the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages or another event. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest
Thank you.
of your evening.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thanks, Judith.
Thanks. Thanks. Good to